Imagine the scene. It's 1942, somewhere deep in the Pacific. The air inside the submarine is thick, a stale mix of sweat, diesel, and crushing tension. For days, you've been a ghost in the depths, stalking a Japanese oil tanker, a fat, slow prize carrying the lifeblood of the Empire's war machine.
A critical target.
The approach is perfect, a textbook execution. Through the periscope, the target fills the crosshairs, the firing solution is locked. Fire one, the order is given, and the boat shudders as a 1.5-ton Mark 14 torpedo slides from its tube, then another.
Hearts pounding, waiting.
The crew holds its breath, counting the seconds, waiting for the massive explosion that will send thousands of tons of steel and oil to the bottom. But the seconds stretch into a minute, and there's only silence.
Or worse.
Or worse, a faint metallic clank heard over the hydrophones, the sound of a state-of-the-art weapon hitting the enemy's hull and harmlessly bouncing off.
Devastating. And this wasn't just a one-off, was it?
Not at all. For the first 18 months of the war, this was the scandalous, infuriating reality for the U.S. submarine force. They were sent on the most dangerous missions imaginable, armed with a primary weapon that was fundamentally broken.
Yet somehow, by 1945, this same force was credited with sinking over half of Japan's entire merchant fleet, strangling its island economy into submission.
So what happened? How did they turn a colossal technical failure into one of the most decisive yet unheralded campaigns of the Second World War? That is the mission today. We are diving deep into the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific, unpacking this staggering narrative of technological catastrophe, strategic transformation, and ultimately the economic strangulation of an entire empire.
It really is an incredible story of adaptation and, frankly, sheer perseverance. To understand how they pulled off that silent victory, I think we need to look at, well, maybe 3 core lessons that really jump out. First, the huge systemic danger of sending complex technology into battle without proper testing. And importantly, how institutional resistance, bureaucracy nearly drag the whole thing out even longer.
Right, the human element behind the hardware failures.
Exactly. Second, the absolutely transformative power you get when you combine good intelligence with smart logistics. How they went from basically hunting blind to setting up calculated ambushes.
From guesswork to precision.
Precisely. And third, what this whole campaign teaches us about the strategic vulnerability of any island nation that depends on imports, especially when someone figures out how to shut down the sea lanes. It wasn't just about naval battles. It was about choking off the enemy's entire economy.
Weaponizing geography and supply lines?
That's it.
Okay, let's start with that opening disaster, the Mark 14 torpedo. Now, when we say state-of-the-art, this thing really was, conceptually, an amazing bit of kit for the time.
Oh, absolutely. On paper, it was incredible. Think about it, 1.5 tons of machinery. Initially carried over 500 pounds of TNT, later upgraded to nearly 700 pounds of Torpex, which was much more powerful.
And it wasn't just a dumb bomb, right? It had guidance systems.
Right. It was designed like a mini robot submarine. It had gyroscopes for steering, hydrostatic devices to keep it at a set depth. Really complex stuff for the era.
But that complexity hit a fatal flaw, didn't it? Stemming from when it was developed.
That's the key. The design work happened in the 20s, but the crucial development and, more importantly, the testing phase ran smack into the Great Depression.
So budget cuts.
Massive ones. Each torpedo cost around $10,000. That's a fortune back then for something you plan to, blow up.
Like buying a luxury car and immediately driving it off a cliff?
Exactly. So the Navy, specifically the Bureau of Ordnance Support, they just didn't do enough realistic testing. They couldn't afford to fire off dozens of these things in practice runs. They relied on calculations and very limited trials.
And the price for that thriftiness was paid almost immediately after Pearl Harbor.
Instantly. And heavily. The failure rate in the field was shocking. From December 41 right through late summer 43, maybe only 1 in 5 torpedoes actually worked as intended. Sometimes even less.
1 in 5.
Think about the early Philippines campaign. We had something like 23 of our newest submarines out there, getting into position, firing torpedoes, scoring what looked like direct hits on warships, and sinking absolutely nothing. 0 warships sunk by these brand new subs in that initial period, despite hits.
I just can't wrap my head around the impact on the crews. You train for years, you execute perfectly under extreme stress, you launch, and then nothing. Or that clank.
It's soul-destroying. Imagine the captain's perspective. You've risked the boat, risked every man aboard, you've achieved the perfect setup, and your weapon fails. Now the enemy knows you're there, the depth charges start coming. It's not just failure, it's potentially lethal failure caused by your own side.
A mix of cold fear and just white-hot anger, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. And what made it so infuriating and difficult to solve was that the problems were layered. It wasn't just one thing wrong, it was multiple things. And fixing one often just revealed the next one underneath.
Yeah.
Like peeling a rotten onion.
Okay, let's peel that onion. 3 main defects, you said. Where do we start?
Let's start with depth control. This was the first big one they sort of figured out. The torpedoes were consistently running deeper than they were set, sometimes by as much as 10 or 11 feet.
So if you aimed for just under the waterline.
It would sail harmlessly right under the keel of the ship. Gone. And because it never got close enough to actually hit anything, any problems with the exploder itself stayed hidden. You just thought you missed or aimed wrong.
And board, the Bureau of Ordnance insisted their depth gear was fine.
They swore it was perfect. They blamed the crews, the calculations, the sea conditions, anything but the torpedo. It took Admiral Lockwood, who was commanding subs down in the Southwest Pacific, getting absolutely fed up.
It took matters into his own hands.
He did. In June 42, down in Albany, Australia, he used his own funds, can you believe it, to buy fishing nets. He had the USS Skipjack fire a practice torpedo set for 10 feet straight at these nets. And the torpedo punched a hole in the net at 25 feet deep. Clear, undeniable physical proof. You couldn't argue with a hole in a net.
That must have finally gotten board's attention.
It forced their hand. They finally had to concede the depth mechanism was faulty and issue corrected settings fleet-wide. So, okay, problem 1 sort of addressed.
Sort of, but fixing the depth meant the torpedoes were now actually reaching the target depth. And that's when the next problem popped up, the premature explosions.
Exactly. Now the torpedoes are running at the right depth, getting close to the target hull, and suddenly crews start reporting massive explosions. But before impact. These were the infamous prematures caused by the Mark VI magnetic exploder.
The super secret high-tech feature.
That was the idea. The magnetic influence exploder, the MK6, was designed to detect the ship's magnetic field and detonate the warhead directly underneath the keel. The physics suggested this would be devastating, breaking the ship's back.
Sounds good in theory.
But it was highly classified. The crews had basically zero training on it, zero experience. And it turned out the exploder was just way too sensitive, or perhaps fundamentally flawed in its design or manufacture. When the torpedo got near that big metal hull, boom, too soon.
And from the sub through the periscope, a premature explosion might look like a hit, right? Big splash, maybe some debris.
Precisely. That's what made it so insidious. The captain sees a huge column of water, maybe hears a bang, logs it as a hit, potentially a kill. But the target ship, damaged maybe, but often not critically, just sails away. It created this false sense of success while the weapon was still failing.
So board is still getting reports of hits, even if the ships aren't sinking as expected.
Right, which probably delayed acknowledging this problem too. This went on well into 1943. Eventually, Admiral Nimitz, the top commander in the Pacific, CNC and Peak, had enough. He ordered the magnetic feature to be deactivated on all torpedoes in the Pacific Fleet. Just turn it off.
A decisive move. But you mentioned an organizational quirk.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Admiral Christie, who commanded submarines in the Southwest Pacific area, wasn't directly under Nimitz's CNC-PAC command structure. He still believed board's assurances that the MK6 was sound, maybe thinking his guys just weren't using it right. So he initially ignored Nimitz's order.
Kept using the magnetic exploder.
He did, for months. His boats kept suffering these premature detonations, failing to sink targets that boats under Nimitz's command might have gotten. It wasn't until March 1944, almost a year later, that Christie finally gave in and ordered them deactivated in his area too. Think of the missed opportunities in that theater because of that command division and misplaced trust.
Incredible. Okay, so depth is fixed, magnetic exploder is turned off. Now they're relying solely on the old-fashioned contact exploder. Just hit the side of the ship and it should go bang. Simple.
Should, but didn't. This is when the crews started hearing that sickening clank over the hydrophones. The torpedo was hitting the target squarely and just bouncing off, a complete dud.
This must have been the absolute lowest point.
It was the final straw. Lockwood, who by now was the overall submarine force commander for the Pacific Fleet, basically went rogue against board. He started ordering live fire tests himself, not just against nets, but firing torpedoes against the submerged cliffs off Kahului Island in Hawaii.
Firing them at cliffs?
Yeah, just to see what happened. They actually recovered a dud that hadn't exploded after hitting the cliff face, and that allowed them to finally confirm the failure was purely mechanical, inside the contact exploder mechanism itself.
And the technical reason is just mind-bogglingly basic, almost.
It's infuriating when you understand it. The contact exploder used a firing pin. Think of a small, mushroom-shaped piece of metal that was supposed to slam forward into a primer cap on impact, setting off the main charge.
Standard stuff.
But the Mark 14 hit hard. The deceleration force when that 1.5-ton torpedo slammed into a steel hull at speed was immense. This created so much friction on the little guide studs holding the firing pin that the firing pin simply couldn't overcome it. It basically got jammed in place for the split second needed. It decelerated with the torpedo instead of moving relative to it.
It stalled out because of physics, because it hit too effectively.
You got it. The impact itself prevented the impact from triggering the explosion.
And the fix didn't come from the scientists at board, did it?
Nope. It came from the guys in the field, the technicians at the Pearl Harbor submarine base. They were the ones who got really hands-on. They devised this ingenious, if crude, test. They took dummy warheads filled with cinder concrete.
Cinder con.
Yeah, cheap, heavy. They dropped these things from a height of 90 feet onto a solid steel plate, trying to replicate the impact force.
Did it work?
It replicated the failure beautifully. 7 out of 10 times, the dummy firing mechanism failed to trigger on impact. And their solution was brilliantly simple.
What was it?
They realized if the firing pin itself was lighter, it would generate less friction during that moment of deceleration. So they machined down the firing pins, reduced their weight, tested it again with the drops. And suddenly, it worked almost every time. The lighter pin could overcome the friction.
That's incredible. Fixed by machinists at the forward base, using concrete blocks and ingenuity, completely bypassing the official design bureau.
It highlights the total failure aboard. Their refusal to listen, their arrogance in blaming the crews, calling it the skipper's alibi, that was arguably the biggest failure of all. It wasn't just bad engineering. It was bad leadership and institutional resistance.
That resistance cost time, ships, and lives.
Absolutely. There's a consensus among submariners from that era that the torpedo problems extended the war significantly. But there's a key date to remember. September 30th, 1943.
Why that date?
That's when the USS Barr put to sea. She was the first submarine to sail with torpedoes that had all the fixes incorporated.
Yep.
The corrected depth settings, the magnetic exploder deactivated, and the new lighter contact firing pin. That date, late 1943, really marks the moment the U.S. submarine force finally had the weapon it needed. The start of the truly effective campaign.
Okay, so by the fall of 43, the subs finally have torpedoes that, actually explode when they hit something. That's a huge step.
Monumental.
But just having a working weapon doesn't guarantee success, especially in the Pacific. It's unbelievably vast. How do you even find the targets? Sinking half of Japan's shipping requires more than just reliable torpedoes. It required a fundamental shift in strategy, right? And that started incredibly early.
Almost immediately. Just 6 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. naval commanders issued a directive that changed everything. They ordered unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan.
Unrestricted? That sounds significant. What did it mean in practice?
It was a complete reversal of decades of U.S. naval doctrine and even international norms they'd previously defended. Before the war, the doctrine was that submarines primarily supported the main battle fleet. And if they attacked merchant ships, they had to follow strict prize rule surface, warn the ship, allow the crew to evacuate before sinking it.
Very gentlemanly, but not very effective in total war.
Exactly. The unrestricted warfare order threw all that out. It meant U.S. submarines were now authorized to sink any Japanese vessel, warship, merchant ship, tanker, anything flying the Japanese flag without any warning whatsoever.
So overnight, the target list expanded dramatically from just the Imperial Japanese Navy to essentially the entire Japanese maritime economy.
Correct. Every ship became a legitimate target. But again, finding them was the challenge. And that's where the second key element of the transformation comes in. Intelligence. Specifically, signals intelligence.
Ah, code breaking. This is the MAGIC project, right?
Yes, MAGIC. This was a joint effort between the Army's Signals Intelligence Service, SIS, and the Navy's Cryptanalysis Unit. They had some early successes breaking Japanese diplomatic codes, like Purple Lee, which gave valuable political insights.
Useful, but maybe not for finding a specific tanker convoy.
Right. The real tactical game changer for the submarines came from breaking the main Japanese fleet operational code, known as JN-25.
That must have been incredibly difficult. How did cracking JN-25 translate into sinking merchant ships, the Marus?
It took time. And the Japanese actually changed their merchant ship codes after a pre-war intelligence blunder by the U.S. tipped them off. But by January 1943, U.S. intelligence, building on the JN-25 breakthroughs, finally cracked the specific code used for routing merchant convoys, the so-called Maru code.
And what could they learn from that?
Suddenly, it wasn't guesswork anymore. U.S. submarines started receiving highly detailed intelligence packages before or during their patrols. These weren't just vague Patrol Sector X orders. They contained things like the projected route of a specific convoy, its speed, what ships were in it, its destination, its estimated time of arrival at certain points.
Wow. That changes everything.
Completely. Think about the difference. Before, a sub might spend weeks patrolling a huge square of ocean, maybe seeing nothing, burning fuel, crew morale dipping. Now, they could be told, essentially, go to these coordinates. A convoy of 5 ships, including 2 tankers, will be there in 48 hours, heading northeast at 8 knots.
It turns them from hopeful hunters into, well, informed predators waiting for the prey to walk right into the trap.
That's a perfect analogy. The whole dynamic shifts from speculative searching to calculated interception. They weren't stumbling in the dark anymore. They were executing ambushes based on incredibly accurate, near real-time intelligence. And now, with torpedoes that worked, the results were devastatingly effective. Magic multiplied the impact of the fixed torpedoes exponentially.
So intelligence tells them where to be. But hitting a moving target from a submerged, moving submarine, especially at night or in bad weather, still isn't easy. Did they have any technological advantages beyond the torpedo itself?
They did, and this is crucial. The American submarines had a piece of equipment that was generations ahead of anything the Japanese or even the Germans possessed. The Torpedo Data Computer, or TDC.
A computer! In the 1940s.
An analog computer, electromechanical, but yes, a sophisticated calculating machine. It took inputs, target speed, its course, the range to target, the known speed of the U.S. torpedo, the desired running depth, and it continuously calculated the precise firing solution.
What does firing solution mean in this context?
It means the exact bearing or angle the torpedo needed to be fired on to intercept the target, considering the target is moving and the submarine itself might be maneuvering. The TDC automatically factored in all these variables in real time.
So the sub-commander didn't have to do complex trigonometry in his head under fire?
Exactly. Manual plotting, especially while submerged and trying to remain undetected, is incredibly difficult and time-consuming. You have seconds to make a decision. The TDC took data from the periscope, sonar, and crucially, radar, integrated it with the sub's own gyrocompass readings, and spat out the precise gyro angle to set on the torpedo.
And you mentioned radar.
Yes. U.S. submarines had effective surface search radar relatively early in the war, certainly much better and more widespread than Japanese radar. This was huge. It allowed them to detect ships on the surface at night or in fog long before the submarine itself could be seen. They could track targets, feed the data into the TDC, and set up attacks without even needing the periscope until the last moment. This negated Japan's traditional advantages in night optics and surface action.
So working torpedoes, pinpoint intelligence, and superior fire control, that's a powerful combination. But there's one more piece, isn't there? The sheer logistics of operating across the Pacific.
Absolutely fundamental. The Pacific Ocean is enormous. A submarine patrol, starting from Pearl Harbor, going all the way to the shipping lanes off Japan or in the South China Sea, and coming back, that round trip could take weeks, even months. A huge chunk of your patrol time was just spent commuting.
Wasted time, essentially.
Exactly. So the development and strategic placement of forward operating bases, FOBs, was critical to increasing efficiency and pressure.
Where were these bases initially?
At the very start, it was mainly Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and then Australian ports like Fremantle on the west coast and Brisbane on the east coast. Useful, but still very far from the main Japanese supply routes.
But as the Allies advanced across the Pacific,
they started establishing new bases much closer to the action. Places that became synonymous with the submarine campaign. Midway, yes, but then islands like Saipan, Guam, the massive lagoon at Ulithi Atoll, and eventually even Subic Bay back in the Philippines.
Setting up a submarine base on a remote island sounds like a massive undertaking itself.
It was a huge logistical feat. These weren't just gas stations. The Navy brought in specialized submarine tenders, essentially floating workshops and supply depots, like the shells of the Fulton class. They brought in floating dry docks capable of lifting a submarine out of the water for major repairs.
So they could do almost anything right there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Hull repairs, engine overhauls, reloading torpedoes, replenishing supplies, and crucially, giving the crews some rest and rotation closer to their patrol areas. Moving the main operating base from, say, Pearl Harbor to Guam or Ulithi could cut transit times drastically. Maybe reduce a 10-week patrol cycle where 6 weeks was travel down to maybe only 2 weeks of travel.
Which means much more time actually hunting.
Far more time on station in the enemy's backyard. This acceleration of operational tempo, enabled by logistics, was just as important as the intelligence or the torpedo fix in ramping up the pressure on Japan.
It's also worth remembering these subs weren't just sinking merchant ships, were they? They had other vital, if less heralded, roles.
That's a really important point. They did a lot more than just commerce raiding. They conducted vital surveillance and reconnaissance missions, sneaking close to shorelines to take periscope photographs of beaches ahead of amphibious landings.
Preparing the way for the Marines.
Exactly. And they performed lifeguarding duties. They'd position themselves along the routes of American bomber strikes, ready to rescue downed air crews.
Did they save many?
The numbers are impressive. They rescued 504 Allied airmen from the Pacific during the war, including a future U.S. President, George H.W. Bush, who was rescued by the USS Finback.
Wow. And covert missions, too.
Yes, particularly in the Philippines. U.S. submarines played a key role in secretly landing agents, weapons, supplies, and radios to support the Filipino guerrilla resistance against the Japanese occupation. Maintaining that resistance was strategically important, though those missions did sometimes divert submarines away from attacking shipping. They were versatile, indispensable assets.
So let's put it all together. By late 1943, you have submarines with working torpedoes, guided by magic intelligence to the right spot, using advanced PDC and radar for accurate attacks, and operating from forward bases that keep them on station longer. The stage is set for the kill.
It really is. And the target, Imperial Japan, was uniquely, fatally vulnerable to this kind of warfare. They fundamentally miscalculated the impact of a determined submarine campaign against their economy.
Why were they so vulnerable?
Because Japan is an island nation with very few natural resources of its own. To fuel its war machine, to feed its population, to run its industries, it was almost entirely dependent on imports shipped by sea.
Do we have a sense of the scale? How much shipping did they need?
Estimates suggest they needed about 5.9 million long tons of shipping capacity, operating constantly just to maintain the war effort and the basic domestic economy. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China, food from across Asia. It all had to come by ship.
And geographically, those ships had to pass through specific areas, didn't they?
Yes, geography was key. Almost all the vital resources from the southern resource zone, Southeast Asia, had to funnel north towards the Japanese home islands. This meant passing through relatively narrow sea lanes, natural choke points. The most critical were the Luzon Strait, between Taiwan and the Philippines, and the Taiwan Strait itself.
Perfect hunting grounds for submarines lying in wait.
Exactly. Once the U.S. subs had the tools and the intel, they could concentrate their efforts on these choke points and just savage the convoys trying to get through.
And the results were stark.
Overwhelming is the word. By August 1945, Japan's merchant marine was functionally destroyed. They had less than a quarter of the shipping tonnage left compared to what they started the war with in December 1941.
And how much of that loss was due to U.S. submarines?
U.S. submarines alone are credited with sinking 4.78 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. That's 54.6%, over half of all Japanese shipping losses in the entire Pacific War, from all causes combined, including aircraft, mines, surface ships, everything.
Over half, just from the subs. That's astounding.
It really is. And the pace accelerated dramatically once the torpedoes worked and magic was fully operational. Look at 1944 alone. In that single year, U.S. submarines sank over 600 Japanese ships, totaling nearly 3 million tons.
More than the previous 2.5 years combined.
Yes. More tonnage sunk by subs in 44 than in all of 41, 42, and 43 put together. That shows you the combined impact of fixing the weapon and knowing exactly where to point it.
You started seeing individual submarines racking up incredible scores, didn't you?
You did. Boats like the USS Tang, under the famous commander Richard O'Kane, and the USS Flasher. Each of them sank over 100,000 tons of enemy shipping single-handedly. They became legends. But it was the cumulative effort of the whole force.
And the prime target within that merchant fleet had to be the tankers, right? Cutting Japan's oil lifeline.
Absolutely critical. Remember, Japan had virtually no domestic oil production. Before the war, they actually imported something like 60% of their oil from the United States itself, ironically.
Until the embargo.
Right, so seizing the oil fields in places like Borneo and Sumatra was a primary war aim. They got the oil fields, but the American submarines made sure they couldn't get the oil home to Japan where the refineries were.
They systematically targeted the tankers.
Relentlessly. And the impact rippled throughout the entire Japanese war effort. By 1944, oil deliveries from the southern resource zone back to Japan had slowed to a trickle. Refineries sat idle for lack of crude.
And that had direct military consequences.
Huge ones. The most obvious was aviation fuel. The shortage became so severe that the Japanese military had to drastically cut back on flight training hours for new pilots. They just didn't have the gas. Air operations were curtailed.
And this ties into one of the most desperate measures of the late war.
Directly. The severe lack of aviation fuel was a major contributing factor in the adoption of formalized kamikaze tactics. The thinking became, if you only have enough fuel for a pilot to make a one-way trip, you might as well train them for just that. Make the aircraft itself the weapon.
Wow. Logistics, or the failure of logistics, dictating extreme tactics.
It's a brutal example of how strangling the supply lines forced Japan into desperate corners. The submarine campaign wasn't just sinking ships, it was reshaping Japan's military options.
And the impact went far beyond fuel, didn't it? It hit the entire economy, the civilian population.
Totally. It wasn't just oil and iron ore not getting through, it was food. It was raw materials for all industries. Post-war analyses, including statements from the Japanese cabinet itself, concluded that the loss of shipping was arguably the single most decisive factor leading to Japan's defeat. They flat out said, the greatest cause of defeat was the loss of shipping.
More decisive than the island hopping, more decisive even than the strategic bombing in the end.
In terms of crippling the ability to continue the war, many argue yes. The bombing destroyed cities, but the submarine campaign starved the entire nation and its military machine long before the B-29s arrived in force.
I recall reading accounts from Japan during that time, not about bombings, but just about scarcity, about the cold because there was no kerosene, about food rations getting smaller and smaller, factories closing not from damage, but lack of materials. That quiet, grinding halt.
That's exactly it. It was a slow strangulation. And that diary entry you mentioned captures it perfectly. It wasn't always dramatic explosions. It was the creeping paralysis of the economy, the empty ports, the hollowed-out feeling of a nation cut off from its lifelines. That silent pressure was immense.
And that starvation effect extended to the Japanese military itself in horrific ways.
Tragically, yes. Because ships couldn't get through, established Japanese garrisons on islands across the Pacific were completely cut off from supply. It's estimated that over 1 million Japanese soldiers died, not in combat, but from starvation and disease in these isolated outposts, because Tokyo simply could not reach them with food or medicine. The submarine campaign effectively condemned them.
There's also a deeply tragic aspect involving Allied prisoners of war, isn't there?
Yes, very dark chapter. The Japanese used many of the same merchant ships, the Maru's, to transport Allied POWs between camps, often in horrific conditions. These became known as hell ships.
And U.S. submarines, unaware of the human cargo,
Attacked and sank them just like any other enemy vessel.
We estimate around 44 Japanese ships carrying POWs were sunk by Allied action, mostly submarines. The death toll among the POWs from this friendly fire is estimated to be somewhere between 10,800 and perhaps as high as 21,000. A terrible unintended consequence.
A brutal war indeed. And the success of the U.S. submarine campaign came at a significant cost to the American submariners themselves.
It absolutely did. It was incredibly dangerous duty. Around 16,000 Americans served on submarines in WWII. Of the roughly 288 submarines deployed, 52 were lost, 51 of those in the Pacific theater.
What does that translate to in terms of human cost?
The fatality rate for U.S. submariners was about 22%. Roughly 1 in 5 who went out on patrol didn't come back. That made it one of the highest loss rates of any branch in the U.S. military during the war.
Though still significantly lower than their German counterparts. Much lower, yes. The German U-boat force suffered catastrophic losses, something like 70% fatality rate. But 22% is still incredibly high. And perhaps the most bitter irony is that at least 2 U.S. submarines, the Tolebi and the famous Tang, were actually sunk by their own malfunctioning torpedoes making circular runs and hitting them, lost to the very weapon defects they fought so hard to overcome.
A truly painful end note to the torpedo saga. So looking back at this deep dive, the whole story arc is just remarkable. You start with this massive, embarrassing technological failure, the Great Torpedo Scandal, born from peacetime budget cuts and bureaucratic arrogance.
A really bad start.
But then you see the perseverance of the crews, the leadership of people like Lockwood who refused to accept the status quo, forcing the Navy to confront the problems and find solutions, literally in the field.
That bottom-up pressure combined with enlightened leadership was key.
And once they had a working weapon, you combine that with the revolution in intelligence from code breaking, the magic intercepts telling them where to go, and the smart logistical support from the forward bases.
And suddenly the submarine force transforms from this frustrated, often ineffective group into arguably the most strategically decisive weapon system in the Pacific theater.
From technological disaster to operational mastery to strategic victory through economic strangulation.
That's the arc. And I think the lasting takeaway isn't just about winning battles at sea. The real success of the U.S. submarine force was how they fundamentally understood and then weaponized Japan's greatest vulnerability, its dependence on maritime resources.
They didn't just sink ships, they sank an economy.
Exactly. The quiet, methodical, relentless destruction of the Maru fleet, ship by ship, tanker by tanker, became the underwater equivalent of strategic bombing. It achieved victory not primarily by destroying Japan's navy, though they did plenty of that too, but by dismantling its entire industrial supply chain from the seafloor up.
It really underscores that wars aren't just won by the fanciest hardware.
Not at all. This whole story shows that things like effective intelligence, flexible logistics, and maybe most importantly, the organizational courage to admit failure and adapt are often far more critical than just having the most advanced weapon on paper. They turned a broken weapon into a war-winning campaign through sheer grit and smarts.
So perhaps the final thought for you to consider is this. The history of the U.S. submarine campaign in the Pacific serves as a stark reminder. For any nation heavily reliant on the sea for its resources and survival, the most dangerous threat might not always be the visible power of aircraft carriers or battleships. Sometimes it's the silent, unseen, persistent closing of a vital choke point, patiently cutting the lifelines one ship at a time.